Hey there, everyone. It's Camber here with the Yo Pro No. I am excited to introduce you all today to Danny Brill, 26-year-old software engineer at Facebook, currently living out in Boulder, Colorado. Danny, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been a fan for a long time. It's cool to switch the tables and be behind the screen.
Yeah, I love to see you following us along for the past year or so. And I always like to share how I got connected to my interviews. And this one goes way back. So Danny and I knew each other in, I want to say high school, but it may have even been middle school. We're, both from Baltimore. Who knows really when it all started, but we go way back. And I noticed that Danny was, following us in our audience. And I just reached out. I wanted to reconnect and hear more about what's been going on those last 10 years. So I always like to share that. It's great to see you again, Danny.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. We have a lot to cover. It's
We
been a long
do.
time.
We do. We have a short period of time, but we're going to see what we can do. So why don't you go ahead and just give us a brief background on yourself? So I already said where you're from, but maybe tell us a little bit about what happened right after you left Baltimore.
Yeah, so if I could break the mold a little bit and go back a little earlier than that,
All right.
um,
Good.
I think that just from watching your videos, one really important piece of context for me is growing up in Baltimore. Both of my parents are entrepreneurs. Neither of them finished high school. Nobody in my family went to college. And no one ever really had like a regular sort of office job like I do. So leaving Baltimore, headed to college, I didn't really have like any other than like peers in school and their parents and stuff. No one really knew like what this was going to look like. It was hard for my family to be like, oh, you need to take these classes. Like you should go to your academic advisor and talk about like getting on the right track early, whatever. Like no one knew what an academic advisor was at the time. So I headed to CU Boulder out in Colorado, and we kind of chatted before the interview. I've tried to leave this state like 3 or 4 times now, and every time I leave, it just like reels me back in.
Keep coming back.
Yeah, I absolutely love it out here. I am moving to Mountain View for Facebook in the next few months, so that'll be interesting. We'll see how long it takes before I'm like running back to Colorado again.
Right.
But I actually started out as a business administration track and kind of fell in love with the whole computer science thing. It was like the first academically successful thing I had ever experienced, coming from like a wildly unsuccessful high school career in academics. And I think like that one little taste of academic success was all I needed to like shoot me off to the races. Mm-hmm. So finished the computer science degree. I kind of held on to some of the business stuff. So I started a company in 2016, which was famously unsuccessful, but it was still a great experience. And I also did like a little business entrepreneurship track thing on the side in college as well, which I'm really, really stoked about doing. I think it would have been easy, which is the thing that I think a lot of people in my industry get lost in. It would be really easy to just get lost in the engineering and just focus on that stuff. But at the end of the day, like we'll get into this, I'm sure, later in the interview, but like the soft skills, the human connection, the people skills, that is so fundamental to all of the work that you do. Like whether you're an engineer working on like the tiniest little laser focused component of a larger system, or you're like super customer facing in a sales or marketing or HR role, whatever, that human component has been like a major driver in everything that I've ever done. And I think it's the reason that I haven't fallen into like the archetypical engineering mold, despite running from like engineering job to engineering job.
Absolutely. Thank you for that context. I think that's a really, really good point, all of those points. But one thing in particular that I want to pick out. So you kind of laid out your career path really nicely for us. You showed us how you went from, point A to point B, but how did you know really that the engineering world was for you?
That's a loaded question. So I don't think I do know that. I think
That's
like
great. I love the honesty. Yeah.
The last post that you made, right, was about faking it till you make it. Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think for me, I found that some of the things that led me to traditional like failures in the academic arena turned out to be like beneficial in certain ways. I know that sounds like really cliche, like taking a weakness, turning it into a strength, but I have like the maximum amount of ADHD I think a human being can have. And
Fair.
in the engineering world, I think I just found certain areas, especially like fundamental like programming exercises, to work like really well with that mindset. Like you're juggling a lot of things at once. There's sort of like an exciting, tangible like puzzle to be solved, and I think that really like activates all these different parts of my brain that need to be activated at the exact same time for me to focus on anything. um so I think that's what like really led me to computer science and engineering in the first place. And sort of like I said before, having been like really non-academic when you and I were friends way back in the day,
I don't remember that. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
maybe I was faking it till I made it this whole time and I didn't know it until now. Once I started like actually finding something that I found like even a modicum of success in, it opened up like the floodgates of academia for me. And not just academia, but I think like a bigger venture of just self-discipline, of realizing that like, okay, I like this whole programming thing. I like tech, I like computers, I like technology, but if I were to learn like maybe a little bit more math, then I could dig in a little bit deeper into some of like the game development that I'm doing. Or if I want to get into like machine learning, because I think that's like actual real magic in the human world, I need to understand like the fundamental linear algebra behind all of these machine learning concepts before I can like really dig into this thing that I'm excited by. And then, I think you're only like an arm's reach away from realizing all of like the benefits of digging into like other areas of academia outside of just the STEM field. So I've definitely found, in a way that I never expected, this shouldn't shock anyone at this point, like not a huge reader growing up, really not a huge reader now. Like for me, it just takes like so much effort for me to get through a book, and I do it, but I do it like fighting tooth and nail with myself the whole way. But I think that like academic appreciation for any field of academia, and this is why like liberal arts programs are so valuable in my opinion, appreciating like the process of learning a new concept in like discrete math, it's the same appreciation that you get for understanding how like a literary tool is useful in the narrative of a story that you're trying to tell. And I think that like those appreciations in totally disparate fields are coming from like the exact same place in your brain and your heart. And so like by appreciating one thing like computer science and math, I think it really led to just like an appreciation for the whole process of just like learning self-discipline, academia, and that kind of like took me to where I am today, I guess.
Yeah, and I love your honesty. I mean, you said you don't know if it is the thing. Like you don't, and that's because you're still figuring it out. That's what our 20s are for. And I
For
also
sure.
think that's kind of what life is for. Like some people don't even figure this out until long after their 20s. And so I think it's really incredible to see that progression and that transformation that you just described. So thank you. I felt like it was a really clear overview of kind of what has led you to where you are today. And so 2 questions I have for you now are really about your day to day. So tell us, for anyone who is listening in or watching this interview, what are some kind of pieces of advice that you would share with them about what your day to day looks like and what they might want to think about before they jump into a role like this?
Sure. So there's like this really archetypical wheel that you can get on in, I think, any engineering track, but especially computer science. There's like a really cookie cutter formula for you go to school, and then this is the book that you buy at the end of your program. This is the website that you go to just like grind out programming puzzles. This is how you practice for the interview that you're going to undertake. So I think one thing that I've run into a lot talking to people outside of the field that always seems to be like kind of surprising is the structure of these interviews in the first place. So the like typical software engineering interview usually starts with like a little bit of soft skills, like just enough to get you in there to make sure that you can like communicate at a fundamental level, which is few and far between sometimes in the industry. And then they sort of like usually slam you like right away with technical questions, programming puzzles. They'll like set you up at the whiteboard with a white erase marker, and they'll frame like some borderline riddle sometimes, and a lot of times it doesn't really even have anything to do with like software engineering principles or like your programming ability, and then you're just like standing at the whiteboard sweating it out trying to solve these problems in front of senior engineers that you've never met before, whose job it is sometimes to kind of intimidate you, and then you just like come out of it with your head spinning hoping that you did well. And I think that just like the context that I sort of gave you before, it's really easy to get lost in like the rabbit hole of just being an engineer who can bang these problems out without really providing like the business value, the context behind it, like putting a human being in front of your solution and trying to figure out like why that matters in the first place. And so the day to day, assuming like you got through the sweating it out in the interview thing, they floated you an offer and you decided to take it, and now you're like sitting at your desk day one and you're like, what the hell, I'm totally unqualified, like why did they hire me in the first place? The imposter syndrome sets in like before day one. And so imposter syndrome is a thing that like I've always struggled with. I think like everyone in some way struggles with it. It's not like unique to me in any sense, but if you've ever experienced like professional or academic failure, entrepreneurial failure, and if you're someone that feels like you have an ability to like get people on your team, which is a strength that I've always felt that I've had, but in a way that's like gasoline on the fire of imposter syndrome, because whether it's like me being in a professional role, whether it's like getting my private pilot's license, like the first time I ever flew a plane solo, I was freaking out in the air in the exact same way that I freak out at work with imposter syndrome, because I'm like, you know, am I really ready to be like flying alone, or have I just convinced my flight instructor because he likes me as a person that I'm like qualified to do this thing? And like, this is the end of Danny Brill's story. Like, I'm going to kill myself in an airplane because I convinced someone that I can do a thing I can't do. And so I think like the biggest, for me, the biggest source of professional and academic success, and I think like emotional and like human connected success, and also like success in overcoming my own imposter syndrome, has come from compassion for all things, which is the first thing that you throw out the door when you become an engineer. I think like the last thing that anyone who's in like an applied math degree or like a computer science PhD is thinking about is like compassion as your whatever. Like,
I can only imagine that's a no.
Yeah, I just don't think like it's not something that like anyone talks to you about. There isn't like a tangible like, okay, I'm compassionate, and because I'm compassionate, this is the result. Like, there isn't like a key metric and result relationship there. But I think that having compassion for your users, having compassion for the other developers, managers, engineers in test, QA, sales, marketing, everyone end to end, like having compassion for all of the people around you, especially that end user, leads to, bar none, like the best product design possible. Because in this case, like you're decoupling yourself from that archetype of like key metric and result of like push a feature, look at the bottom line. Push a feature, look at like the benchmark, the performance output that you have now on whatever system you're working on. And now what you're looking at is like, why am I developing this feature in the first place? And once I do develop it, like, what is the thing that's going to stop that feature from being as impactful or beneficial to the end user as possible? And so like when you approach it from a perspective of compassion, you're putting yourself like in the lived experience of the end user. And so this seems like maybe an indirect way of getting around to it, but I think the way that weapon is used against imposter syndrome is having compassion for yourself and sort of thinking about, well, if I'm not so worried about like the key metric and the result, and I'm just sort of looking at like my lived experience in a compassionate way, then I'm treating every day as like an opportunity to grow unobserved by yourself. Like you're removing yourself from the human experiment of like, what can I learn and how can I apply it to my professional success or success in whatever your venture is. And I think that like you have to decouple that before you can ever attack like reaching whatever peak or pinnacle you're going for. Like you have to decouple that so that you can immerse yourself like in the experience of growth before you focus on this key objective.
Right. I love that. Keep going. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're totally fine. Yeah, and I think that has sort of been a guidepost for me in like so many different facets of my life, like not just professional success, that like in the same way that I think like an emotional relationship that you have with someone, if you don't decouple yourself from like the checkpoints of a relationship and just think about like what it is you're looking to like gain in your own life and like what you enjoy about like yourself and like where sort of like your motivators come from in a relationship, like what makes you happy and why, and like
yeah,
what
that's
do
a great comparison. I think people can relate to that, and if they don't relate to what you were sharing already, but the piece about compassion is really what broke it down for me, because you don't really think about that when you think of software engineers. You just don't. That's sorry
totally.
to say that, but it's just not really
No,
the
you're
stereotype.
right.
And so I think that's really important to mention. And you also mentioned, imposter syndrome in there. And that's something that's relatable to all people that are listening, whether they're in this industry or not. And so that's what I always love about these questions. I ask people that I'm interviewing, there's 99% of the time it's applicable to other industries, but you definitely mentioned a few that are specific to tech and to, software engineering. And so bringing it back to, you work for this huge company, right? You work for Facebook. Tell us what that's like, because I think people, they see, one of the biggest companies out there, and people think it's really sexy, right? Like, tell us what it's like. I mean, is it sexy working for them? Is it, what can you share with us?
I think sexy is a really tricky adjective to apply to software engineers, but so I'm pretty new. I've only been at the company for a few months, and I have to say that like so far, maybe they're really good at indoctrinating you on day one, but I have just been so pleasantly surprised with so many different components of like the onboarding experience. So just to be really candid, hopefully I don't get in trouble for this at some point. The two things that I was really worried about joining a company like Facebook, and I guess there's the most obvious one is like, okay, it's fast paced, it's a big company, it's more elite than the company that I was at. So like there are some stakes there. It's going to be harder to prove myself, and I can't be so complacent in my day to day. But the two like real core fears were I'm going to join a sea of straight white tech dudes that look like me and talk like me, and like every conversation is going to be someone else basically regurgitating like my daily life. And that's not a thing that I really ever wanted. And then the other fear that I had was like the politics around the company. So like obviously there's some trickiness with working for that, right? And on day one, I was just kind of blown away. Like day one of onboarding. We didn't touch the tech at all. It was all about like, these are the problems within our company. Like we know they exist and you're here to solve them. This is like our main focus right now. It wasn't like, my fear was like, oh, I'm going to join this company and we're going to be so like laser focused on the tech that there's going to be this weird thing in the back burner that's sort of like slowly smoking away. That's like all of the negative sentiment around this thing. And it's just going to be something that we ignore in our day to day and that I deal with at like Thanksgiving and Christmas with my family.
Right.
But literally meeting one, it was like, we're talking about everything that's probably popping into your mind right now when you think about like some of the tricky politics around a company like that. And I think like half of our day was just based around building like the most inclusive and accepting environment possible. And that like you're all here because at some point after proving that you could do the work, you proved that you understood why we're doing it in the first place, and that you can connect on a human level with the people around you and the people that you're building and designing for. And ultimately, like that's what it's not what we want, like it's what we need. You know, it's a social company. It's like built into the mission. And so I was like really pleasantly surprised by both of those things. It was way more inclusive than some of the other companies that are a lot smaller and maybe had more bandwidth to be like more human connected than a company like this does. They just didn't prioritize it in the same way. Yeah. So that's been really nice. And then as far as like the actual work goes, it's been a huge adjustment for me because it's a bottom up structure. Mm-hmm. So you don't really have a manager like coming to you and saying, hey, this is what you're going to do today, handing you like these nice, neat little like bite-sized pieces of work that you can like unfold, place on an assembly line and like ship off to your QA. Mm-hmm. It's like you're going out and engaging with like your entrepreneurial self and finding a project that you think is going to be valuable and then building that thing. And if at the end of the day, like the thing that you chose isn't valuable, then you need to like take a step back, recalibrate and figure out like, why'd you go down this rabbit hole in the first place? Like, who could you have reached out to? Like, what research, like what learning could you have done along the way that maybe would have shown you this isn't where you should be headed? Like you need to pivot or like drop it on the floor and pick something else up instead. Mm-hmm. So it's been a challenge for sure. It's really intimidating to like join this massive, fast-paced organization and have someone just be like, okay, like go figure out what you're going to do today. You're like, I don't know, I'm just trying to survive.
But it seems, I know it's been a few months, but it seems like it's a good fit because you always want to challenge yourself, right? Like you always, like if you want to grow, you really should be challenged. And so it sounds like there's a nice level of challenge, but also a pleasant surprise that, you know, you feared a couple of things going into it and those have kind of dissipated since you've started there. So I'm really happy to hear that for you, especially because I think you kind of broke down some stereotypes of the company and working for such a huge organization like Facebook. So thank you for sharing that. Now, so thank you for sharing that part. But with the limited time that we have left, I want to open the floor and ask you what did we not cover today that you want to share? I know we normally like to talk about a certain hardship. So if you want to take the last few minutes to talk about a hardship and how you've overcome that, if you want to talk about, you know, life outside of the office, is there anything that you feel is really important to share to the audience today before we wrap up?
Oh, so many things. We touched on the compassion thing, which heading into this was something that I really did want to talk a lot about. Mm-hmm. And I think like, I'm going to keep harping on it for one more minute. Okay. I really feel like compassion is a thing that gets lost in our professional world in so many ways today, that we're constantly like comparing ourselves between one another, and we're constantly comparing ourselves against our former self and our expectation of our future self. And that lack of compassion, inward and outward, I really think is what leads people to like stick into a position that they hate. But change is like the only constant, right? And so I think the last thing that I'll say about like the concept of compassion is that trust yourself to be successful in whatever like that future endeavor looks like for you. And success doesn't mean I'm going to spend 4 years at JP Morgan and then like I'm going to be a senior analyst and I'm going to make $400,000 a year. It can also mean I'm going to spend 6 months at whatever, some other company, realize that like I hate this thing and that it's ruining me as a person, and that I'm limiting myself, inhibiting myself from becoming like what it is I want to be, from like finding the most successful place for me, whether you're measuring success in freedom, happiness, output, money, whatever. Like, I think that that whole notion of compassion comes from removing the word quitting from the concept of leaving
Mhm.
and
Mm.
moving towards the place that like you into the archetype of what you think you should be. Because this whole experience, being in your 20s in a pandemic, like finding professional success, whatever that means, there's no roadmap. Like, this is a completely abnormal thing that we've just decided arbitrarily to apply to like every human lived experience. And so to expect yourself to behave or react normally to a completely abnormal thing is illogical. So I think like embrace the abnormality of the experience that you're living and just find compassion for yourself and the people around you, and know that like if you live every day, I think with like that compassion first and foremost, like open mind, open heart, and try to approach everything from a place of like acceptance, openness, and logic, then I think eventually like you'll wind up in the right place. It's just a matter of like having trust, belief, and compassion for yourself.
Right, which is hard. And so I think it's really good that like you're telling everyone, cut yourself some slack. Like, this is okay, but try to figure that out. And that's what this time is all about. So I think that's excellent advice, a great way to wrap up the interview. And thank you again, Danny, for just joining me for the Yo Pro No. I really appreciate your support over the past year as an audience member and now as an interviewee.
It's a genuine honor. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.